Hi everyone, so we're back for the third part of this video series. So we're looking today at the interplay. Just to quickly recap, last time we talked about the resonating, which was the way that being kind of reasserted itself and raised itself as a question, raised itself as a problem that we needed to interrogate again. And it's kind of like the later Heidegger equivalent to the call of conscience, which we saw Heidegger discuss in Beying and Time. So that was the resonating. Being's become a problem again, it's become an issue. Today we're looking at the interplay, which is kind of like the next step here. And the interplay is basically the transition from what Heidegger calls the first beginning or the guiding question, those two terms are the same, to the other beginning or the basic question. And those two terms are also interchangeable. So you've got this idea that we're making a transition from the first beginning to the other beginning, or in the same with the same meaning, we're moving from the guiding question to the basic question. Those two ways of phrasing the interplay are the same. And so the first part there, the first beginning or the guiding question, this is basically the history of Western philosophy since Plato, where we've been stuck in metaphysics. And the question we've been asking is, what are beings? And we've been looking to beings to understand that. And the transition we're going to make to the other beginning or the basic question is an attempt to go beyond metaphysics and to ask what is being with a Y. So just by way of introduction, this is definitely not a counter movement. And the reason... Okay. I don't know if you can hear that. Okay. Sorry about that. So anyway, it's not a counter movement because all counter movements and counter forces are essentially co-determined by that which they are counter to. And we talked about that in the first video in the series, I think. And there was a Kierkegaardian thought, the way that in order to break from something, to break from a prior way of thinking or way of dealing with things, requires a jump, a leap. It requires a complete break. You can't change something. You can't essentially change something if you remain trapped within that mode of thinking. And and a counter movement remains stuck in the way of thinking or the framework that one is trying to get around, one is trying to overcome. So it's not a counter movement because all counter movements fail as essential transformations of history. And that's how we talked about this in the first episode. We talked about being and time as a reaction. So Heidegger's clear that being and time wasn't that clean break. It wasn't the restart that we're looking at now. It was a reaction to the old framework, to the first beginning or the guiding question. So let's have a look at the first and the other beginnings in a bit more detail. The first beginning, the guiding question. We said the question here is, what are beings? And the problem with it is that it starts its questioning from beings themselves. And so in doing that, in starting its interrogation by looking at beings themselves, it's presupposing those beings. So we're not getting at the foundations. We're not going as deep as Heidegger wants to go. We're not getting to being itself. So in asking about beings, what it asks for is determined then as that which is common to all beings, i.e. a general characteristic which can apply across all kinds of beings, and this has the character of what Heidegger calls beingness. And what you get from it then is just a list of categories which apply to all beings in common. And that's basically what ontology is as well. Right? Ontology is that investigation into being, and it generally revolves around, or it has revolved around, categories that apply to beings and within which we can understand individual beings. So that's the first beginning. And I've got an important note here, if I can make sense of it. Beingness is just another object of representation for the subject. That's right. So this is another problem with the first beginning. What we get out of it is that, let's say, a list of categories or some general features that apply to all beings, but this, the result, this list or these features, end up just being another object which we can posit for ourselves. And so that the root being that we were after, we've ended up with just another being, another object which we represent to ourselves. And then the question then obviously is, well, what's the being of that object that we've found? And so you still haven't gotten to the root problem, to the root, to the foundation that Heidegger's looking for. So the other beginning, on the other hand, the other beginning, or the basic question, doesn't start from beings, or beings as such, or beings as a whole. Instead, it leaps into the truth of being as being itself, being with a Y. And so the question is, as I've said a couple of times, what is it that allows beings to appear in the first place? That's what being. That's what Heidegger's searching for in being. The way Heidegger says this is, the truth of being is the openness for essential occurrence as such, which is basically the same thing. There are three attitudes he talks about here as being the basic disposition of thinking when we're talking about the other beginning. And those are shock, restraint, and diffidence. So shock is the way that we are surprised by the fact that beings are, and the fact that being itself has withdrawn from beings. So there's a reference back to the resonating that we talked about last time. The restraint involves being ready for the refusal of being. And this, we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but the refusal of being, in short, is the way that being conceals itself. Being itself, the way that conceals itself, so it doesn't appear to us as a being, as another object. And so that's captured in restraint. Like I said, we'll talk about that later. And diffidence, which is nothing to do with being shy or reserved. This is, Heidegger defines as a drawing near and remaining near to the last God. And that is a very difficult idea to make sense of, but I'll try to do that a little bit towards the end of the series. We'll talk about the last God, and I'll delay that. I'll delay discussion on that for a little to another time. So the other beginning isn't a new one. It's not a new beginning. That's another point that Heidegger makes. So it's not a counter movement, but it's also not a new beginning, because he thinks a new beginning would quickly become out of date. It would just become old-fashioned, or it would lose its novelty. So he doesn't want it to be something new which we can get sick of. Rather, this is where he calls on that Kierkegaardian idea of repetition, which we talked about with the resonating as well. So it's not something brand new that we can a novelty, a fad. It's nothing like that. It's rather a return to the original question, but asking it in a deeper way, delving a little bit deeper than being has been treated thus far in Western philosophy. So the first beginning, experiences and posits. This is what Heidegger says. Actually, this is just a way that Heidegger differentiates between the two. So the quote is: "The first beginning experiences and posits the truth of beings without asking about truth as such. The other beginning experiences the truth of being and asks about the being of truth, in order first to ground the essential occurrence of being and to let beings arise." So that's a fairly nice summary of these two different approaches. I think that's good for there. So we've also just a couple of other notes on this topic while we're here. Thinkers who transition to the other beginning aren't understandable in their own times. Heidegger talks about this, and we've talked about this a little bit before. Where did we talk about it? In another video series, we talked about philosophy being something that doesn't add to anything. It's not practical. It doesn't have any useful applications. It doesn't even help society, Heidegger says. Where did we talk about that? I think it was Introduction to Metaphysics. And so he just brings that up again here. Thinkers who transition to the other beginning, they're not understandable in their own times. Their arguments, their way of thinking seems weird and strange. And he gives three reasons here. The first is it's not a stepping over. It's not a stepping over from the first beginning to the other beginning. You can't just progress in a logical fashion. It's a complete break, and it requires a leap, which isn't foreshadowed by anything in the first beginning. So because of this, because it requires a leap, it seems completely random. It seems completely it seems out of place. It seems strange, and that's why people who think this way are not understandable in their own times to other people, because their thinking and their thinking is such a break from what's come before. He talks about understanding implying certainty as well, and Heidegger values uncertainty, because uncertainty means that we're still in a questioning mode. We're still open to questioning beings. We don't understand beings. We don't know them. We're not confident. We're not certain in what we think we know about beings. So they're still open to question. So we can still interrogate them and find out and dig deeper beneath beings themselves. Whereas if we're certain, there's no point in questioning. Why do we have to ask any questions? We know what beings are. They're atoms, they're the movements of atoms, they're the interactions of forces, fundamental forces of nature. There's nothing, there is no question there. So he values uncertainty. He values that questioning. And understanding, if we have understanding, that goes against this approach. Finally, understandability implies verification by facts. So if you understand something, then you're able to verify, you're able to prove it by appeal to facts. Problem is, and I'll quote this, No thinking of being, no philosophy could ever be verified by facts, i.e. by beings. So, and this again is another Kierkegaardian theme, that the way what we're looking for, being itself, philosophy, it's not verifiable by facts, by beings. Again, we're going beyond beings, so we can't then look to beings to verify what we find, to explain or to prove our results. And to understand something would require some kind of verification, and that's not going to happen here. So for those three reasons, Heidegger thinks the thinkers of his other beginning aren't understandable in their own times. There are a couple of consequences to this idea of the interplay, and they're kind of important. I'm not sure if we've talked about, I think we might have talked about them a little bit, but Heidegger ends up rejecting ontology and metaphysics, which seems a little bit weird because ontology was what Being and Time was all about, right? And he used the word ontology and ontological throughout that whole book as referencing this authentic, this deeper questioning, this probing into being. But he rejects it here. And the reason, so ontology is the study of being. The reason he rejects it is he thinks it delimits the measure and the sphere of inquiry. And that goes back to what we talked about just before with the goal of the first beginning being to uncover categories for being in general. And that's what ontology has, whether it's right or wrong, that's what ontology has done in Western philosophy. Ontology means that being as a general, as an understanding of beings in general. So looking for the features, the aspects that are common across all beings. That's what ontology, the study of being, has become. That's what it means. So Heidegger rejects that description now of his philosophy. And he also rejects metaphysics, which we talked about a little bit already. You can't get from beings to being itself. It requires that leap. And if we just if we tried to progress from the first beginning to the other beginning without the leap, if we just tried to make to build on what was there before, it will end up, all we'll end up doing is just bringing a new application of the guiding question of the first beginning, rather than getting to this deeper understanding we're after. So the last thing here about the first beginning and the other beginning, Heidegger equates the first beginning with the phrase being and thinking, where being is the beingness of beings, i.e. the general category, the general categories that apply to all beings, those things which are common, or that thing which is common to all beings. And thinking is representational representational assertion. So that kind of thinking is that old mode, that Cartesian mode of thinking, subject-object dichotomy. So that's what being and thinking is. That's what the first beginning is wrapped up in. The other beginning, on the other hand, is described by the phrase being in time, where being is that whose truth is investigated. So it's the deeper it's the deeper interrogation going to the truth of beings, not the beings themselves. And where time is the essence of truth. So an investigation into truth itself. So we've got that idea, being itself and truth. So you can see Heidegger saying that the big thing there, I think, is time. For Heidegger means the essence of truth. And it's an odd call, and I think it's definitely a big switch from the way he thought of time in Being and Time, the book. But I'm not even sure it's really that valid. I mean, can you just say time means the essence of truth? Maybe. And I mean, I guess there'll be some arguments for that coming. But yeah, that's the way he approaches it anyway. The first beginning, being and thinking. The other beginning, being and time. So there are a couple of things I want to go through before I wrap up here. The first is a brief history of the first beginning. We've looked at this in much more detail in the video series on Introduction to Metaphysics. But there are a couple of new points here, I think, and it's worth just having a look at briefly. So Heidegger says Plato made the being of beings the most general thing. So that was the first occasion where we deviated from being itself. Parmenides and Heraclitus being the two who started the authentic interrogation, and Plato reduced it to this ontology, the most general characteristics. So this idea of beingness, the being of beings, became what is most eminently real, and that's an allusion to Plato's theory of forms, I think. So where the most real is not anything concrete, it's some abstract idea, some abstract idealized notion of what the thing or what things are. And Heidegger says all Christian, post-Christian, anti-Christian, and non-Christian Western interpretations of beings all build on this central idea. So that's the history of Western philosophy. Thanks to Plato, has gone off on this tangent, has gone down the wrong path. The next step, the next big step, is in nominalism, and I don't think we've talked about this before. In nominalism, the factuality of the individual became that which is genuinely real. So we stopped looking to the forms, and we placed the genuinely real in the individual. And this led to Descartes' cogito, Descartes' idea of the subject, in which the representation is that which is most real. So the idea of the subject becomes the touchstone for what's real, what's true. And from there it's a short step to Hegel and his absolute idea as being the foundational cornerstone of reality. So this is the history of Western thinking as being and thinking. And here being is understood as the beingness of beings, and places being grasped in this way into relation with representation, with representing or thinking. So that's just kind of an encapsulation of that whole the history of Western philosophy. And as I've said before, he thinks that even Nietzsche didn't break out of this. He was, for sure, he fought against it, but in fighting against this tradition, he was an opponent. He was offering a counter movement, and so he never broke out of the traditional framework. And in the end, what he did do is just interpreted beings in a different way. So he never got to the question of being itself. He simply he took on those traditional the traditional way of thinking and way of approaching being through beings, and simply interpreted beings differently, maybe with the idea of something like the will to power and the master-slave morality, those kind of things. So he never broke out of that mode of being, that mode of thinking. And the very last thing, we've talked about metaphysics already, but I just wanted to touch on a couple of other points before I leave it entirely. So metaphysics is an attempt to go beyond physics, beyond beings, but in attempting to go beyond beings, it interrogates beings themselves. And so its core question, what are beings? If it can uncover the deepest essence of beings, the thing that all beings share, it thinks it will have achieved its goal. However, in interrogating beings, it's looking for something that is. It's looking for another being. And I think that's really the big point here. In interrogating beings and asking beings to get to being, it necessarily is asking about being. It's asking about a being. And we've already established that being itself can't just be another being. Because if it's another being, then we're justified in asking, what's the being of this being? So we never, so being itself just cannot be a being. That, if you just tuned in right there, that would sound like absolute gibberish. But philosophy, true philosophy, is not understandable in its times, right? So I think that's it. Heidegger doesn't want to oppose metaphysics. Yeah, this is the last thing. He's after an overcoming of metaphysics. So he describes his project as an overcoming of metaphysics, not as an opposition to metaphysics. He still aims at the being of beings, but he's starting not from beings. He's inquiring into the truth of being. And that is the interplay. So next week, or next video, we'll keep going. I can't remember what the next topic is, but you'll find out about it shortly. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon.